Right, so let's get started. Welcome to this unique mode of teaching for this particular week. Next week, we'll see each other in the classroom, and I'm very much looking forward to that as always. The plan I have for today is, as usual, first I'll summarize the content of our previous lecture, okay, and then like to focus on one particular element in our broadly defined topic, which is ideological competition and Cold War, liberalism, capitalism, and democracy versus socialism, communism, and the dictatorship of the proletariat. I think we will have time to focus more often on liberalism, capitalism, and democracy. So today, what I plan to do, and let's see how it turns out, is to focus on the appeal of socialism and why socialism, particularly after the Second World War, became so popular. So many people were willing to freely accept some form of socialism, albeit arguably not Soviet-style socialism, okay, but in some form, national form of socialism. This ideology appeared to provide answers for all those questions that were generated not only by the Second World War, okay, but also by the global economic crisis itself. So we'll focus today on the appeal of socialism and how come it was so attractive and how it worked in practice as well, because theory is one thing, reality is another, as always. So, last week, we discussed two particular approaches to international affairs, which can be succinctly summarized as opposite to each other. The first one is universalism, sometimes labeled as idealism, or sometimes you can also hear the word Wilsonianism. Why is that? Well, because Woodrow Wilson, the American president and leader of the United States during the First World War, is the founding father of this idea, or more precisely, he is associated with promoting this particular idea in international arena. Okay, so what universalism means? Well, it is the belief that there is a set of basic values that are shared universally, globally, by everyone. Okay, we all think that there are certain fundamental elementary values that all humans share, have in common together, and based on this very elementary basis, we can build a superstructure. In theory, at least, universalism prioritizes cooperation, collective security, and the rule of international law. Let's not forget that we are talking about global arena, okay, over power politics and military competition. The concrete expression of this particular principle is the creation of the United Nations, adoption, the Charter of the United Nations, and the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. During and after the Second World War, this particular approach was advocated by Franklin Delano Roosevelt, so the American president, the leader during the Second World War. But as I said, the founding father typically is seen as Woodrow Wilson. This approach in international affairs is sometimes succinctly summarized as right makes might. Okay, what's just, what's according to the law, justifies particular action or particular actions in international affairs. The opposite principle, universalism, is particularism, but I chose this word only because it is a direct opposite word to universalism. More often, you will encounter the word realism in international affairs, or even more often, realpolitik. Okay, what is realpolitik? Well, realpolitik, once again, is the opposite approach to idealism. And realpolitik stresses that each state or culture has its own unique traditions, values, and interests that should not be subject to universal norms. Okay? At least in theory, once again, it often leads to policies that favor national sovereignty over international norms. It focuses on power and national interests rather than moral and ideological universals. And it views international politics as an arena for power struggle where states act based on their own needs and power rather than shared global values. I think I already hinted that this approach is now embraced by the United States, President Trump, but you should be aware that this is nothing new in history of humankind. Okay, in the 19th century, for instance, British Empire is a textbook example of this approach as well. In continental Europe, also the 19th century, more precisely the second half of the 19th century, is Germany. Okay, after unification of Germany, German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck is like a synonym for this particular approach. That's why sometimes we even pronounce Realpolitik with German accent. Once again, I already said this approach can be summarized as right is might. Okay, exactly the opposite of the previous principle. If you are powerful enough, if you have army strong enough, you can basically do whatever you wish. Okay? I also mentioned that the second principle is inextricably linked to one particular term, and then one particular term is the sphere of influence. What is sphere of influence? Sphere of influence is a geographic or political region where a major power exerts dominant influence or control, often without formal annexation or direct governance. Major powers' influence can be military, political, economic, cultural, religious, and I'm sure that you could also think of other terms. It is designed to prevent interference of other major powers in these regions, and small states within this sphere of influence have limited autonomy, but of course it varies according to the particular context. In the context of Cold War, I'm sure you are all aware that Europe was divided into two camps, more or less two. Okay, Eastern camp, Soviet bloc, dominated by the Soviet Union. The Western camp, the capitalist bloc, dominated by the United States. Please be aware of the thing that there are always some exceptions. Okay, Austria, Switzerland, and Sweden and Finland were not members of any particular bloc, but they all retained capitalist form of government. Okay, or the political system is traditionally associated with the Western form of government. And I also urge you to be aware of one fact, and this is also nothing new in human history. Okay, I've listed some examples of the division of the world into spheres of influence. Already in the 15th century, under the sanction of the Catholic Pope himself, the world was divided into two spheres of influence, the Spanish sphere of influence and the Portuguese sphere of influence. Once again, this explains why Macau, for instance, was a Portuguese colony and Brazil was a Portuguese colony, and why Central America, until today, for instance, speaks Spanish. Once again, this particular approach is important, and this particular term is very important because it rapidly becomes very, very firmly established in international jargon, international vocabulary. Once again, especially Americans now speak of their exclusive sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere, and the expression of this It's obviously the deposition of President Maduro in Venezuela. Now their eyes probably are turning towards Cuba. Very, very concrete steps being done already. And in the eastern part of Europe, at least, Russia more or less says the same. Ukraine is the exclusive sphere of influence. Russia, okay, and no other major power should or could do anything except with explicit Russia's endorsement. Okay, so once again, historical term, but also very, very, very important for contemporary politics. And then I also mentioned that the three major, probably, powers during the Second World War had particular approaches to waging the Second World War, okay, and also to the post-war order, post-war arrangements, post-war settlements, and they each approached the negotiations about the post-Second World War settlements with different ideas. Americans, very, very, very generally speaking, wanted to learn from their mistakes. Okay, obviously, this is closely connected to the League of Nations and the United Nations and the failure of the League of Nations and perfection of United Nations, because American president during the Second World War, once again, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, was hunted down by the fiasco of his predecessor, Woodrow Wilson, and the fact that American Congress did not approve the entry of the United States into the League of Nations. Okay, so that's the American approach. British approach, fundamentally different. Of course, they supported Americans because they needed them, but their fundamental interest was the preservation of the British Empire. Okay, let's not forget that the British Empire during the Second World War is still there. In the interwar period, it reaches its largest extent, okay, and it's the biggest empire in human history. So obviously, the British wanted to preserve it. And the Soviets are hunted down by another form of the burden of history, we might say, and that's chronic insecurity. Why chronic insecurity? Well, because Russia, before beginning of the Second World War, was already invaded twice. Once by Central Powers, Germany and Austria, and second time Western powers during the Russian Civil War. Okay, and then the third time, the beginning of the Second World War from the Soviet point of view. Okay, so 3 times in 25 years only. Okay, first half of the 20th century, 3 invasions into Russia, Soviet Union in 25 years. And obviously, they wanted to prevent any power from doing this again. Let's also not forget that there were other invasions in the late 18th, Napoleonic Wars already in the 19th century for the invasion of Russia. So Napoleonic Wars and invasion of Napoleon and his conquest of Moscow, okay, and the Crimean Wars, the middle of the 19th century, Western powers again against Russia. This all leaves Russia, Soviet Union, chronically insecure. Okay, so Stalin's primary wartime goal is securing his country from being a target of another invasion in future. There are 2 very, very, very concrete particles of this approach on a general level. One is expanding of Soviet territory and protecting core Soviet regions. What are Soviet core regions? Definitely Moscow as the capital for the Soviet Union. Definitely St. Petersburg, Leningrad. Why? Well, because the Soviet Revolution started there, okay? And also Kiev. Kiev, why Kiev? Because the Russian history, once again, is inextricably linked to what's today Ukraine, okay? But Kievian Rus has its origins in Kiev, obviously, in today's Ukraine. So, to protect these core regions, additional extra territory is needed, and that's why the Soviet Union demands annexation of most of the territories, or all of the territories, at least at the beginning, that it lost as the result of the First World War, Brest-Litovsk peace, and the Civil War. Okay? Concretely, Baltic states, Eastern Poland, Bukovina and Bessarabia, and also Finland. But Finland is really a special case. So that's the first particle of this approach. The second particle is creating a belt of friendly regimes around this expanded Soviet territory. So it's like a multi-layer approach that is to protect core territories of Russia, Soviet Union. Okay, creating belt of friendly regimes that we clearly see on this map once again. After the Second World War, all the regimes that borders Soviet Union, with the partial exception of Bulgaria, okay, and East Germany, and also Finland. Bulgaria and Germany are exceptions because they don't border Soviet Union, okay. But all these regimes, in one form or another, established firstly people's democracies, okay, with certain levels of independence, but from 1948, Soviet style of communism. And this is all there to provide extra security to the Soviet Union, because if new war broke out, obviously the invasion would be conducted from the western direction, and Poland, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, of course, East Germany as well, and Romania would have to be conquered first in order to get to the core regions of the Soviet Union. British perspective. Once again, the Brits are victims of their erstwhile imperial glory. Because once again, in the 19th century, the British Empire is the sole global power, sole global superpower, we might say. And it reaches its maximum size after the end of First World War. So, from this particular perspective, I think it makes sense when Winston Churchill declares British war aims during the Second World War in November 1942 as such. We mean to hold our own. I have not become the King's First Minister in order to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire. So, preservation of the British Empire is the fundamental goal of British politicians during the Second World War. And last week in the lecture, I made probably a bit exaggerated claim that the primary interest of the Brits during the Second World War was not to defeat Germany, which was a pleasant bonus anyway, okay, but to preserve the British Empire. Of course, the defeat of Germany led to the preservation of the British Empire for 2 years only, okay? But let's be aware of this hierarchy of priorities, okay? Preservation of the British Empire, definitely number one. And closely associated with this approach is another element, which is preventing dominance of any power in continental Europe. In other words, preventing the existence of a hegemonic power in continental Europe. This is why This is why the United Kingdom fought against Napoleon. This is why the British Empire fought against Russia in the Crimean War. This is why the British Empire fought against Germany during the First World War. This is why they fought against Germany during the Second World War. And this is why Russia, Soviet Union, became the principal enemy after the end of the Second World War during the Cold War. Okay, so from this perspective, you can clearly see a very clear pattern of British behavior in international arena. And from this point of view, once again, this is not idealistic at all. This is not idealistic at all. This is brutal, pure realpolitik. So much as for Comrade Stalin. Okay, so in this particular sense, Stalin and Winston Churchill are more similar to each other than they would probably be willing to admit. And these two elements in British strategy decisively shaped their approach towards military operation during the Second World War, because the primary concern of the British military strategists was not France, but the Mediterranean basin. Why is that? Well, once again, because the shortest way in this period to India is through Gibraltar and Suez Canal. India is what makes British Empire the empire. Okay, and to secure the lanes, sea lanes, and the shortest way to India, one must secure the Mediterranean basin. Okay, so that's why so much emphasis on the Mediterranean theater. That's why Winston Churchill made that percentage agreement with Joseph Stalin in late 1944. And that's why he tried to secure the dominant British influence. Once again, Greece, definitely, in the British sphere of influence. Okay, that's why he wanted to secure the British influence in Greece. And I think I've already described this quite thoroughly. American perspective, the fiasco of Woodrow Wilson, who, no one else, is closely associated with the idea of the League of Nations, almost like a synonym for this international organization. He is unable to convince the American Congress that it is in the American interest or interests to participate and play a major role in this international organization. So the US Congress doesn't endorse this idea, so the United States doesn't become the member of the League of Nations. And this is one of the fundamental flaws of this organization, because if the strongest power who stands behind the very idea does not participate, it sends a very clear signal. Another problem, obviously, was that the League of Nations did not have any military units at its hand. So even if it wanted to act, they didn't have any means to stop the aggressor, because there were no military units at the disposal of this organization. This led to the failure of the principle of collective security. And directly or indirectly, it's up to you to decide, to the outbreak of the Second World War. Last week, I already mentioned these three crises. Here in this part of the world, in Asia, the attack of Japan on Manchuria. League of Nations can't do anything about that. Why? Once again, well, because it doesn't have any military units. A Abyssinian crisis in Africa. Italy invades Ethiopia, Abyssinia, today Ethiopia. Again, League of Nations tries to do something about that, but in reality, it doesn't work. Sanctions, very limited impact, as always. And of course, Mr. Hitler in Europe. So we have three continents: Asia, Africa, Europe, where the League of Nations is not able to do anything, more concretely, is not able to prevent the expansion of military powers there. And the second element that Franklin Delano Roosevelt wanted to focus on, and the mistake that the Americans did, probably, not only Americans, but to some extent Americans as well, was the issue of international trade. Okay, once the global economic depression broke out, and let's not forget, it did start in the United States, in New York. Okay, once it broke out, all countries very quickly adopted what's called protectionism, okay, particular approach in international economic affairs. And they wanted to protect their domestic markets, their domestic economies from importing goods from other countries. Now, very, very quickly, this led to the collapse of the international trade and only added to the hardship of already troubled enough world. One crisis after another, already beginning of the 1930s, Manchurian crisis, financial economic crisis, collapse of global trade, increase of unemployment, radicalization of entire nations, and ultimately the outbreak of the Second World War. Okay, so collective security, League of Nations, failure, international trade, globalization, first wave of globalization, failure, let's do something about it. And that something is typically, until today, summarized as Bretton Woods system. In other words, establishing global financial institutions that would be backed by the US, obviously, because US as the sole superpower in financial terms, definitely. The US as the sole financial superpower has means to back the new economic system. Not Great Britain, not China, not the Soviet Union, not France, not Japan, only the United States. Okay, that's why the US dollar is backed as a global reserve currency. Until today, we see the impact of that here in Hong Kong. We pay use Hong Kong dollar, which is backed to American dollar. Okay, and a set of new institutions, World Bank, International Monetary Fund, and so on and so forth. WTO used to be important, now very, very distant. So after this fast summary, fast enough, as I hope, we can approach our today's topic, but this background of Second World War is extremely useful, and it's extremely useful because British historian Mark Matsover tells us, that the Second World War was not only about military engagements and diplomatic negotiations. From certain perspective, it was also the struggle for new political order. Okay. It was a struggle for the social and political future of the continent itself, says Mark Matsover in his seminal Europe's 20th century, the Dark Continent, Europe's 20th century. So while we traditionally associate the Second World War with military operations and concentration camps and Adolf Hitler and Nazism and ideologies and generals and battles, if we want to see a bigger picture, Mark Matsover's claim as a starting point is extremely useful because he reminds us that the Second World War was not only about conquering new territories and annihilating entire populations and races. Okay, it was also about the prospect of better future. And he's so astute that he knows that Adolf Hitler and Joseph Stalin were aware of this. And it was their bargaining chip that they could offer to the world. And obviously they did. Now, Nazism and fascism are defeated during the Second World War, obviously, without any doubt. Now people say fascism is on the rise again. Who knows? I don't entirely agree with that, although I do have some concerns. Socialism and communism inextricably, once again, linked to the Soviet Union and Joseph Stalin, because the Soviet Union is the sole communist country, okay, in the interwar period and during the Second World War. Socialism and communism have definitely something to offer, and Joseph Stalin is not shy to play this card very well. Now, obviously, this inevitably leads to another question. What does it have? What does he have? What is so appealing about communism or socialism in more general terms? Okay, let's not forget that we are talking about ideological competition here. All right. So any ideology needs to have an appeal. In other words, needs to be attractive in order to convince, persuade people that they should become socialists, that they should become communists, that they should vote for the Socialist Party, that they should vote for the Communist Party or for any other party. Okay. So my question would be, what is the appeal of socialism? What is the appeal of socialism? And my answer to this, that actually goes deeper into the interwar period, Cold War, Second World War, whatever. It goes as far as to the 19th century. My answer would be that socialism appealed to millions because it offered both an explanation of inequality and, probably even more importantly, a hopeful alternative to the social and economic hardships of modern industrial societies. And if you don't understand this particular thesis statement, okay, might be helpful to quote from no one else than Friedrich Engels, okay, the co-author of the Communist Manifesto, published already in the first half of the 19th century, okay, 1848. And Engels says this: I may sum up my visits to these districts by stating that 350,000 workers in Manchester and the surrounding districts, nearly all live in inferior, damp, dirty cottages. That the streets are generally in a disgraceful state of filth and despair, and that the layout of the dwellings reflects the greed of the builder for profits from the way in which ventilation is lacking. In a word, the workers' dwellings of Manchester are dirty, miserable, and wholly lacking in comforts. In such houses, only inhumane, degraded, and unhealthy creatures would feel at home. And this quote comes from a quite famous pamphlet book, The Condition of the Working Classes in England, authored by Friedrich Engels 3 years before the publication of the Communist Manifesto in 1845. Okay? In my personal opinion, nothing else better describes the appeal of socialism, and nothing else better describes the disadvantage, let's say, or the repellent feature of liberalism. Because in 1845, liberalism is booming, especially in industrial England. Okay? And it makes England and the United Kingdom what it was in the 19th century, which is the global power. But the cost for this is not only miserable working conditions, but also miserable living conditions. And arguably, not much has changed in 100 years, because while these observations from Friedrich Engels are from the first half of the 19th century, there is another intellectual who is closely associated with the United Kingdom, because unlike Friedrich Engels, who is German, that other thinker is a British citizen himself, he himself says almost the same, ironically enough, observing in Germany this time. And he says almost exactly the same. That someone is no one else than British historian Eric Hobsbawm, a Marxist historian. And I want to play a short video in which he, Eric Hobsbawm, describes in the clearest terms why he became a communist, a Marxist, and what was the appeal of socialism for him. So, let's have a look at the video, and then we'll continue with analyzing.
At about this period, 33, 34, the kulak class is being liquidated in millions of peasants are dying, starved, or being deported by Stalin. 33, 34, we're in the midst of the 5-year plan, or the second 5-year plan, I can't remember. But in any case, millions of people are dying in the Soviet experiment. If you had known that, would it have made a difference to you at that time, to your commitment to being a communist?
This is a sort of academic question to which an answer is simply not possible. I don't actually know that it has any bearing on the history that I've written. If I were to give you a retrospective answer, which is not the answer of a historian in something, I would have said probably not.
Why?
Because in a period in which, as you might say, mass murder and mass suffering are absolutely universal, the chance of a new world being born in great suffering would still have been worth backing. Now, the point is, looking back as a historian, I would say that it was probably not the sacrifices which were made by the Russian people were probably only marginally worthwhile. The sacrifices were enormous. They were excessive by almost any standard and unnecessarily great. But I'm looking back on it now and I'm saying that is because it turns out that the Soviet Union was not the beginning of the world revolution. Had it been, I'm not sure. After all, do people now say we shouldn't have had World War II because more people died in World War II than died in Stalin's terror?
So what that comes down to is saying that had the radiant tomorrow actually been created, the loss of 15, 20 million people might have been justified.
Yes. This is exactly what people said about World War I and World War II. Most people have ended up by saying, we think it was wrong in World War I. Very few people ended up by saying, we think it was wrong in World War II.
But isn't there some sense in which the radiant tomorrow can't in principle be built at that cost, because it can't then be a radiant tomorrow, because human beings have memories, and what they remember is desolation.
In the first place, I think, you see, a radiant tomorrow was rhetoric. It was the rhetoric of the people that I believed in too. That's true. But it was pure rhetoric. We didn't believe in radiant tomorrows. We believed in a world rather than no world. We hoped that that would be a far better world. We hoped that it would be, quote unquote, a perfect world in which, you know, in some of us, when you're young enough, you believe that there wouldn't be any unhappiness. There wouldn't be any unhappiness in love in this new world. But that isn't true, even if rationally one knew that this wouldn't be the case. Nevertheless, the real secret of the whole business was, if you believe you are living in a world which is crashing about your ears, your choice is a future or no future. And it was that. If you remember, and I quote it somewhere in my book, the famous phrase by Walter Benjamin about the angel. Huh?
The angel of history.
The angel of history, you see. That what the angel of history sees as he moves backwards into progress is precisely the ruins that are being accumulated by the process of history. So, in a curious way, even though we, as communists and other socialists, if you like, were committed to an upbeat view of the future, we really, living through the period in which we knew we weren't living through a period in which all you have to do is to push the right kind of button and turn the right kind of switch, and everything's going to be lovely.
So, there's one difficult word that Eric Hobsbawm used. And that one difficult word is the radiant. I'm not sure if you've ever heard this term before. Radiant basically means the paradise, the Eden. The end point where we all want to be when we die, basically. But the key distinction between our immortal life and mortal life is that socialism offers the radiant during your mortal life. Okay, like Christianity. So the distinction between socialism and Christianity, for instance, is that Christianity offers you that you would enter heavens when you die. Okay, you live a good life as a good Christian here on earth, and then when you die, you enter heavens. For socialists and communists and Marxists, achieving this is possible already during our earthly lives. Okay. In other words, what I'm trying to say here is that the appeal of socialism, the fact why socialism was so attractive and is still until today, is the promise of better future. And Hobsbawm says that in the video in the clearest terms. Now, if you want to be a little bit more intellectual, I would say, you might decode all of this through Hegelian terms and also through terms of Francis Fukuyama. Francis Fukuyama will discuss at the end. Georg Hegel, a German philosopher and intellectual, very, very, very famous and influential one, composed something which is called the philosophy of history. Okay. And in philosophy of history, he says this: history is teleological. In other words, it has a particular goal, particular objective towards which it is striving. Hegel also says that it is possible to discern certain laws that are universal and that govern human societies. Now, this is the legacy of something which is called the scientific revolution in human history. In other words, Isaac Newton, for instance, the laws of physics. Okay, and this revolution took place in the 16th and 17th centuries, and from the 18th centuries, thinkers and scholars and intellectuals thought that if human is able to discover the laws of nature, he might also be able to discover the laws of human societies. Okay, there is one particular discipline that tries to do that. That discipline is sociology. And sociologists, more or less, try to understand why human societies function as they function. Okay? I already used the word universal laws. Hegelian philosophy of history is profoundly universal. In other words, it is the same for all humans. Now, if you are attentive enough, you might connect this universality with that universalism that I discussed at the beginning of this lecture, because the principle is exactly the same. Okay, there are certain values, certain principles that we all acknowledge and cherish and worship, not because we would be Czechs, Americans, Chinese, Japanese, Indians, and so on and so forth, but because we are humans. And this philosophy of history, Georg Hegel says, is universal. Okay, there is only one humankind. And once again, here is the beginning of internationalism of the communist movements. Okay, because the end point for communists is the global communist revolution. So the entire world would become a communist world. In other words, it would be universally accepted that communism is the supreme system in the world. Now, for Hegel, the global communist revolution obviously was not the end point, because Hegel is at the tail of the Enlightenment, the movement in European history that is concerned primarily with science and reason, but also with human freedom. Okay, for Hegel, the end point is human freedom. Human freedom. Okay, for communists and Marxists, it's the emancipation of the worker. Now, if we want to see more connections between Hegelianism and Marxism, we can see them on this slide. What strikes me here and what I like you to pay attention to is the contradiction between these two bullet points: immaterial forces and material forces. Why is this important? Well, because sometimes Marxism is equated to historical materialism. Okay, what is materialism? Well, materialism believes that we are not driven by the need of freedom, for instance. We are all driven by the need of being well off, being rich, having a luxurious house, for instance. Okay. While Hegel was not as much concerned with economic status, how well off we all are, he was more concerned with the question: are we free? Are we truly free as individuals? And it is because of this reason Hegelianism and Hegel as a philosopher is labeled as an idealist because, according to him, what drives the world is not the material force, not a material incentive, but an ideal, an idea that we all should be free. And because it is idea, he's labeled as an idealist. Okay? For Marxists and most of the socialists, probably, freedom is important, but it's only a pleasant bonus. What's at the bottom of everything is the economic well-being, and everything else, superstructure, as Marxists would call it, is a pleasant bonus. Now, as a reminder, as a summary, what was going on with the world in the 1930s and also in the 1840s when socialism was conceived. There's another video from the same Marxist intellectual and historian, Eric Hobsbawm, who once again tells us what did it mean to become a communist and what was the motivation for becoming a communist. Once again, he is a British Jewish person who was born in Egypt, by the way, because Egypt was part of the British Empire back then. He was raised up in Germany, Interwar Germany, in the 1930s. So he witnessed firsthand this chaos and collapse of the Republican Germany, okay, and the rise of Nazism. And he says in the clearest terms that in this climate, where liberalism is not an option anymore, because it is seen as the root cause of all the misery that is there in Germany, chaos, unemployment, general collapse, okay? When you are raised in this environment and in this climate, and liberalism is not an option anymore, you have only two options. Either to become a fascist or Nazi in Germany, or a communist. And obviously, for Hobsbawm, choice communist. So let's watch the video, and then we'll analyze it further.
So you're a very odd case, in fact. You're an English Jewish boy growing up in the Berlin in which Hitler comes to power.
Yes.
So that's where we are. Now at 14 you do something extraordinary. You join the Communist Party. Now why?
It isn't extraordinary. I can assure you that in 1931-32 it was not at all extraordinary for somebody to become a communist.
Why?
Because you can't understand anything about the first half of the 20th century, at least from 1914 until Second World War, right in the middle, without grasping that most people believed the old world was coming to an end, inevitably. The old world was crashing. We were living in the crashing of an old world. And you had to look for an alternative. It was either a fascist alternative, or it was a socialist alternative, which in Germany in 1931-32 would have meant communist.
So, what Eric Hobsbawm says in the video, in the clearest terms, is that your choice, your option, actually is, once again, and that's the appeal of socialism, not only for those in the 19th century, not only for those in the interwar Europe, but also for those after the Second World War, during the Cold War, okay, is either to have future or to not have future. Why is that? Well, because the present is so terrible, so horrifying, because there are so many mass murdering, so much mass suffering, which is absolutely universal, that the world is crashing about our ears. So once again, the choice, as it seems, is to have future or not. This is once again supported by another British historian, Mark Mazover, who tells us in the same book, Dark Continent, Europe's 20th Century, that the reason why fascisms came into being is the political and social failure of liberal democracy. Now, once again, after the Second World War, fascisms, including Nazism, are defeated. Okay, so it's not the option anymore. It was the option in the interwar period, but it's not after the Second World War. But if we replace fascism with socialism, okay, we can keep the rest of the sentence, and we understand, also with help of Eric Hobsbawm, we understand why so many people embraced socialism. Because fascism is responsible for mass murdering, Holocaust, and genocide, and the Second World War in general. Liberalism is seen as enabler to the Second World War, producing unemployment, poverty, misery, chaos, general collapse. Okay. So what seems to be the right option now, after the Second World War, is socialism and communism. So once again, what socialism offers is the promise of better future. If we are to break it down a little bit, elements of this better future are, number one, liberation or freedom. It's not a coincidence that communist China and its army has the word liberation in its name, okay? Because this is what socialism tries to do, to liberate people, okay? Second element, obviously, it also aims to provide progress, security and justice, particularly in economic terms, and also better equality. Although this is utopian, because we as humans are unequal to each other, okay? So what we can achieve at best, in my opinion, is the most tolerable form of inequality, okay? And also extremely important, and that's part of that radiant word, okay? Extremely important for any socialist and communist ideology is joy, optimism, and galvanization. Eric Hobsbawm says this once again in clearest terms, and he says that there would be no unhappiness. There wouldn't be any unhappy people. Okay? Even deeper analysis. Liberation, freedom from what? From the shackles, or liberation from what? From shackles of the ruling bourgeoisie class or elite. Okay, typically in the industrialized countries, captains of industry. But let's not forget that not every country is as industrialized as England and Germany. Okay, so for those countries that are not industrialized, like Russia, for instance, in the 1970s, or Spain, okay, during the Spanish Civil War, or China, for that matter, from shackles of the ruling bourgeoisie class, which in these countries is still aristocracy, and to some extent in Spain, especially the church, Catholic Church, okay? Progress and security, justice and equality, compared to liberal order, freedoms are confined to political forms. I'll explain this a bit further later. And once again, peace and joy is compulsory. Don't dare to be unhappy in the communist paradise. Okay, optimism and galvanization. In other words, it is socialism that guarantees peace, bright future, and blossoming present after the communist socialist take over. Now, what does it mean? Social and economic justice and equality. Well, we would need to understand what social democracy, for instance, or economic democracy. In our interpretation, this is my own statement. Okay, economic and social democracy means bringing principles of political democracy to economic and social spheres. Now, to decode this, you should have at least an elementary idea of how political democracy works. Okay, political democracy is about elections, obviously, representation. That's why we have parliaments. Okay, and participation. Okay, that you can actually genuinely influence public affairs. What's going on there? Okay. Now, in the reality of the Soviet system, this is translated into working councils. Definitely. The Russian word for this is the Soviet. Okay, so working council literally means the Soviet. That's why we talk about the Soviet Union. Okay, in other words, it's the union of working councils, union of workers. Yeah. So that's the first part. United labor unions. This is labor unions themselves is nothing new. It started in Britain, but united labor unions where all workers are united in one particular organization. That's something unique in the Soviet system. And then all those elements that are more or less known in common wisdom. Nationalization of industry. Why? Well, I'll speak about that a bit later. And also planned economy in the interest of all people. I'll also decode this a bit later. Now, what are some of the concrete manifestations of all of this? Well, let's admit that there are some improvements. And this is the appeal of socialism in practice and also the pressure on the Western countries. Because if socialist countries can provide this, workers in the West want to have it too, obviously. Universal employment, this is a clear and direct reaction to the mass unemployment during the global economic depression. Okay, paid holidays, free healthcare, free education. Still until today in Czechia, for instance, in my home country, old age pensions, the state takes care of the elderly. Okay, maternity benefits, state offers some incentives for young couples. Okay, for them to be motivated to have a family. Subsidized housing. Here in Hong Kong, this one is particularly important. So, to wrap this part up, we are talking about the appeal of socialism. We are talking about some reasons why socialism was so attractive for so many. And we said that it was so attractive for so many because what was before was so terrible that people were willing freely and independently to vote for a change. And they were willing to do this because socialism and communism offered them something concrete, something tangible that they could get to improve their lives. In other words, to have a better future. If you understand what I just said, you also understand these pictures. This, by the way, the sun surrounding Mao Zedong is the radiant. That's the radiant. Okay? That's the end point. That's the end of history. That's where we all striving. That's why this gentleman is showing the direction. This explains the teleological part that I tried to describe. Okay, we know the direction, we know where the end point is, and that's where we are going. Okay, and where we are going is so much better than the present. that we all want to do that. We all want to do that. And it's inevitable. It's inevitable because that's the history. That's where history is going to. Okay? And the end of history is beautiful. Okay? And these slides are there as well. Don't think that this is something unique to China. It's not, obviously. In the socialist countries, we had something very, very, very similar. This is communist Poland after the Second World War, during the Cold War times. This is my home country, communist Czechoslovakia. The communists to better times. Once again, the promise of better future. Okay, so now we'll have a break. And after the break, let's have a look at how socialism actually works in practice. Okay?